Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by Densoro. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about multiclassing and kit bashing. Subtle difference. Densoro says, I've been thinking about the phrase kit bashing, whether it differs from multiclassing and to what extent. Mostly, I've been thinking about how weird Warframe's helmet system is. It's kind of a clunky way to jailbreak your Warframe's hardware and combine them with each other. As a post-hoc, post-release mechanic, the core game wasn't balanced around it. Stringent and arbitrary limiters were required to prevent the game from breaking down entirely. The resource cost and a timer on resource replenishment were certainly choices. The in-universe drama of sacrificing a Warframe was doomed to be undercut from the outset too. You're not slaughtering your precious one and only beloved Excalibur, you're just farming a spare. The strategic permadeath sacrifice mechanics seen in Fuga Memories of Steel wouldn't be right for this game, but flavoring it like this seems at odds with the mundanity. In contrast, I've been contemplating the term kit bashing lately, due to the Gundam Breaker games. Originally, the word referred to mixing and matching pieces from different Gundam model kits to create your own original characters. This was a common enough practice in the model kit collectors' communities that they made a series of games based on the concept. In addition to a selection of handheld weapons and shields for normal attacks, this is where the natural weapons from my previous parlay come home to roost. In Gundam Breaker, your special attacks are tied to specific limbs. You might find a torso with a built-in chest laser, some of those elbow-mounted arm blades I love so much, or a set of wings that unfold into a solar-powered orbital strike satellite. I can't decide if this is an unnecessarily level of information for this discussion, but in the version of Gundam Breaker that I played, each part had a set of tags. If you picked 5 parts that had the same tags, such as mass production, you gained the mass production feat, which raised physical defense by 10%. I don't think that's an unnecessary level of detail, that's a useful example. It's such a sleekly integrated kit-bashing system that it's got me comparing and contrasting other examples. Pokemon Infinite Fusion is a totally legit fan game, wink wink, built around kit-bashing from the outset. You can fuse any 2 Pokemon using a consumable item roughly the same price as a Pokeball. An optional tutorial explains the heritability of faces, color schemes, body shapes, elemental dual typing, and stats. Fused Pokemon will learn moves from both their constituents and evolve asynchronously when either side's conditions are met. For example, Rattata Charmander becomes Rattata Charmeleon, Raticate Charmeleon, and Raticate Charizard. Or I assume you could do it in either order. Basically, to get to the final form for that one, which is Raticate Charizard, you can evolve, the Rattata part and the Charmander part whenever you want, whenever they meet their conditions. Interesting. The knock-on effects of this are huge. Annoyances like Zubat have the potential to become powerful, flavorful fusion ingredients instead of monotonous sawdust. NPC trainers have so much more extra theming and personality, with entire teams of gene-spliced cats or ghosts or eggs, and the totally legit fan community takes this to another level with handmade pixel art, as an alternative to the sometimes janky procedural sprites. That's a cool feature too, though. There's a trainer who attacks you with a horde of face-swapped Magikarp that can actually fight. Magikarp that aren't useless. You can find a fusion partner for any Pokemon that brings out their full potential. As Karen from the Elite Four said, strong Pokemon, weak Pokemon. That is only the selfish perception of people. Truly skilled trainers should try to win with the Pokemon they love best. With the recent update, there are more than 176,400 Pokemon in the world. This is probably a turnoff for the completionists out there. Is there enough time in a human life to see 100% of them now? But I love the fact that there's no longer a single perfect letter grade hovering over our heads. I think you're talking about tier list style letter grades. It feels like it encourages players to embrace chaos, find their own niches, and forge their own identities as trainers, just like the NPCs have. The game also does a much better job putting up a net with core balance changes, quality of life features, and granular difficulty options that test the mettle of your fused creations as much or as little as you like. All this said, I'm trying to figure out why this activates my neurons in a way that Fighter Multiclass Sorcerer doesn't. I know that in D&D, class levels are synonymous with character levels. With a level cap of 20, this seriously limits your real estate. Conversely, in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, character levels govern your stats, while class level is completely independent. You can carry 2 classes worth of action abilities, 1 reaction ability, and 1 support ability from any classes you've leveled. Does this redefine multiclassing somehow, or just shift the limited real estate to another sector? Maybe it really is just the novelty of scotch taping 2 of my party members together like Digimon, or Saiyans. Fusion is just a cheap tactic to make multiclassing cooler. Oh, I don't think it is just a cheap tactic. This is a good one. We got a lot of stuff here. Okay, so there are a couple of different large topics. The first one is discussing multiclassing and kit bashing as terms. As a lot of you already know, I'm not a person who is willing to insist that there is a meaningful, like, single definition, and neither does Densoro in this parlay, but I do still think it's worth discussing. They might feel like different phenomena, and that's still really useful. In fact, I think that vaguer definitions, the type of definition that's useful to most people, are very, very good for indicating that there is a difference between 2 things, just not specifying and insisting on a very specific thing that the difference is. And so here I think that's still really useful. Like, those 2 terms are still very helpful. I want to talk about the number of options in your Pokemon Infinite Fusion example. I think that's really meaningful. And the quote about, winning with the ones you love the best. And you know what, it'd be better to just get into it. Okay, so the multiclassing kit bashing thing. Let's just look at a few examples and break down what is different. I also really liked your Dungeons and Dragons example. Let's start with that. So in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, if you multiclass, you gain levels in one or the other class as you level up. Now, I think the distinction you're trying to highlight is that means you only have 20 levels worth of features that your character can possess. Whereas in other games, maybe, you get all the features from both classes. You just may still not be able to use all of them. And indeed, that's weirdly present in D&D too, right? So for example, if you're a fighter and a warlock, right? Yeah, I have magic. And I have, action surge. I can act twice on a turn with a burst of physical energy. And maybe I have battle master maneuvers. That's cool. But I can't, use all those things at the same time. I'm still limited by the funnel of my action economy. Though I did pick up action surge there. But anyway. And so to some extent, there's a question. Why can't I just have all the features of both classes? Now, of course, it would be stronger than having a single class's options 100% of the time, whereas multiclassing in its current form is an interesting decision precisely because it is often not better than sticking with one class. We've talked many times in previous parlay about multiclassing, and I've always emphasized this point that of all the possible multiclasses in 5th edition, most of them are much worse than just being a single class character, but only because you do trade which options you're getting access to, right? So there's definitely something good about that. But the complexity, the interest in the system is coming from the precedent that you might make more or less decisions. I think there's something meaningful there. Whereas in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, I haven't played this, but the example you gave, it sounds like the basic thing is you pick 2 classes worth of things. Imagine a version of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons where you just always get 2 classes worth of features, and exactly 2, and everybody gets that. That's just sort of the baseline thing. And which 2 classes you combined would still be meaningful. Some combinations would be stronger overall, or do very unique things, or just feel really cool, or just mesh in some way, in a way that others wouldn't. It's not like there wouldn't still be things that were different than each other, that were better or worse, or more flavorful or not, or more fun or not, or whatever. But you would have removed that element of having a sort of, do you want to pull the switch on mixing things together or not? This may be a meaningful difference, though I'm not sure it's a meaningful difference that we should use the words multiclassing and kit bashing for yet. I feel like that distinction maybe could be conceptualized as games that are primarily focused on you making a build versus not. Dungeons and Dragons is a mass market product meant for, everyone, as many people as possible. And a lot of its design reflects this. It's designed to prevent objections as often as possible in some ways, which has some tension. Making something really broad or popular does make it worse eventually. You're making compromises that for any individual person make it worse, but make more total people like maybe okay with it. And I think this is one of them. Dungeons and Dragons has some flexibility where you can not make a build. You need not author a build, and there will still be a game there. In fact, you're not even particularly worse off. Quite an elegant piece of design, in my opinion. Yet you can make a multi-class build that is stronger than single-class characters for the most part. And of course, because they have an intentional informed multi-class and a single class character, because they're both powerful, they also get the flexibility to both be fun. So a positive thing is that system allows a player that isn't interested in sort of authoring a character. They just want to pick druid and they go. And a character that does want to kind of mess about and kit bash, if we want to say, or multi-class. Well, they can smack together a warlock and a fighter. I don't know. That was my one from before. And yeah, sure, like that would be good. It could be very good. So I think that's one distinction. One way you could think about this subject in general is that there are games that maybe their gameplay loop is that you must combine two things. There's a sense of not just choosing, but you have to kind of create a new thing, which I think is mentally different for some people. My perspective, it's nothing. Like, I could do that in my sleep. That means nothing to me. But I understand that it is a cognitive leap for a lot of people to pick and combine two things because they feel like they need to pick and combine two things for a reason. Appropriate things, good things, fun things. They need to kind of imagine what that would be like. They need to do a little bit of game design, basically. Whereas if you could combine two things, but you needn't, the basic thing is that you don't, you just play a single class D&D character. Well, then there isn't that same feeling of kind of requiring authorship a little bit. Don't get me wrong, the way I'm making it sound, it's almost like some people would be paralyzed and physically incapable of doing the one or the other. No, but I do think it plays to people's preferences to some extent. Being honest with you, one of my theses for this parlay is the idea that it seems to me like it would be theoretically better to find a way to make a game that does allow the not authorship, like the way that D&D is doing it, where it's meaningful to combine things. That's still there, but there's kind of a fail-safe if the player doesn't want to. I feel like that is good. After all, it's only by degrees. When you make a character in D&D, you do also pick a background and a race, a species. You very likely might pick feats. You're still making decisions. And so it's a matter of degree. I think having a fail-safe that allows the game to still function or determines what happens, maybe I'll say it that way, when the player doesn't make a sort of authorship and create something in the game is important. My thesis here will be that that is important even should your goal only be to cater to people that want to make builds. So let's analyze a little bit what happens if you don't have there be a sort of like non-authorship default. You can't just pick Druid. You have to pick multiple things. It makes no never mind whether these examples actually do that. For example, in Pokemon Infinite Fusion, I'm imagining that it's still surprisingly viable to fight with an unfused Pokemon, but there would just be no real reason to. Like there might be some weird, corner case meta reason to do that. I don't know. But I would imagine that for the most part, you want to fuse things. Again, to put it a different way, there really isn't any opportunity cost to fusing things, it doesn't sound like. Same thing with your Final Fantasy Tactics Advance example. It doesn't really seem like if you have enough time to prepare, just time expended doesn't count in my opinion. I'm talking about if you use all the resources available to you, and let's say we were to battle in Pokemon Infinite Fusion, there isn't really any reason to not combine Pokemon with your Pokemon. Except there, of course, in these games, there's always some corner case situation where you don't want to, but you get the point. In Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, again, given that you've had time to level up a character at the highest level or whatever, there wouldn't be a reason to not take two classes, is what I'm imagining. Whereas in D&D, there really is. I mean, you take one or the other, and so there is that opportunity cost. This is probably obvious this way. But what I think is noteworthy is this idea that when that's true, it does kind of pressure the player to make a decision, and that isn't all bad. For some people, their story of these games is the kind of madness that results when they have to make a decision, but they don't really have the time, energy, or desire to make an informed decision. They just combine things because you clearly benefit. I think that in some ways that's not a bad sort of gateway to making builds, to get people to make builds where they might not have before, is to give them the assurance that if you make a decision, essentially almost any decision, you do benefit, and therefore go ahead and combine stuff. Now, this seems to contradict with my point earlier about how I was saying I wonder if it really is just ideal to have a system where you benefit from not combining things. You could be a single class druid, and that's very good. You're not losing out over, combining something else in, even though it's possible to benefit by combining things together. The problem with that system, of course, is that it encourages the player not to experiment to some extent. Unless you have a very good idea, and those players, it doesn't matter whether you encourage them to experiment. If you're talking about me, like, you don't have to encourage me to experiment. But the average player, they're not being encouraged to experiment in the sense that unless they have a very good idea for a multi-classed character, it will be worse because there's an opportunity cost to multi-classing. Weirdly, removing that opportunity cost may encourage more building that is maybe better. I wonder. Maybe it's better to just relinquish that feeling of that particular opportunity cost and say it's better for the opportunity cost to be that there's just so many choices. After all, what's the problem here, really? You still only pick two Pokemon to fuse. You still only pick two classes or whatever it is. In these games, maybe you can pick more, but I don't know. And so it's not like you've removed opportunity cost entirely. That probably isn't the best idea, as my current understanding goes. But I think that's what's really exciting about this idea to me, is that maybe it's better to just unleash the player's temptations, to just combine something together and have faith that it will work well. I got really stuck, since a lot of the example is Pokemon Infinite Fusion here. I got really stuck on this thing you said about, okay, so you said you can find a fusion partner for any Pokemon that brings out their full potential. But I couldn't help but think to myself, but no, like, some options would be really bad. Like, and maybe not that fun, like not particularly novel. Like when you said annoyances like Zubat have the potential to become powerful, flavorful fusion ingredients instead of monotonous sawdust. Do they? Like, why Zubat? There may very well be a reason, but I'm just thinking out loud. Okay, yeah, but like, not in a way that many other Pokemon are better at. You aren't better at. Why is Zubat particularly noteworthy? Maybe you're just trying to say everything has relative potential, but I guess what I'm getting hung up on, to explain better, is that it still seems to me like, doesn't the gap between things that are weaker and have less options available and therefore correlate with less fun, and the gap between those things and things that are stronger and have more options and thus correlate with more fun, isn't that gap even larger? Because now I can combine two, high tier things with two low tier things, and I'm comparing those, and now the gap is even larger between those two. To put it one more way, just to make it more practical, imagine I fuse a Zubat and a Rattata, two Pokemon that don't particularly learn a ton of abilities, or a wide variety of abilities, if I recall. Well, Zubat, that's not entirely true. Whatever, this is going to be a contrived example. But then I fuse a Lugia and a Ho-Oh as well. Like they're obviously they may both have merits, and I'm sure there are things that the one can do that the other can't, of course. But I still think it's relevant that one of them has such a larger word cloud of things that somebody might enjoy. To me, that is still an issue. It's still meaningful to somebody who really wants to make a lot of builds if there isn't some mechanism in place that makes choosing an overall less dense option, a Magikarp fused into your Pokemon, that makes that somehow advantageous in its own way, even if it is overall like less word cloud of power or whatever. There being some merit to doing that anyway. I guess to me, the sort of platonic ideal of a build system like this would be that given infinite resources and other competitive players or whatever, you would want to use most Pokemon in fusions. And the ones that you didn't want to use are still pretty cool in their own way. They might just be a little weaker, and that's not everyone's motivation. Like how strong they are doesn't matter to a lot of people. They're still pretty strong, so they still feel relevant, but they're also just fun in their own way. And I feel like because I haven't played this game at all, my limited understanding of that system doesn't sound like it would really do that. It would just create even more of a gap, is what I would think, between people that have like a good idea for a thing that will work well and don't. I have a counterexample, or maybe this is how Pokemon Infinite Fusion works, but here's my example. I used to play a game in college called, oh no, Arcage. Arcage, yes. Arcage has a bizarre class system. You pick 3 of the 10, I want to say 10, maybe 10 or 12, is my brain is going 10 or 12. You pick 3 of the, let's say 12 combinations, classes available, and combine them. So let's say I'm not going to remember what they individually are, but we're not going to worry about it. Let's make them D&D classes. So you pick to be a warlock, wizard, rogue, let's say. Each of those combinations, which is like 100 plus, right, was given its own unique name, and there are some hard-coded synergies between various classes. A labyrinthine web of hard-coded synergies. Now, to be clear, obviously abilities just have synergy anyway, so I'll give you an example. My wizard, warlock, rogue. Well, being a rogue and being able to stealth and stuff has some synergy with being a spellcaster who must stand still and throw a fireball. Of course, right? I can, get into position and only commit when I'm ready, or potentially stealth away because I'm squishy if enemies surround me or I'm in too deep. A lot of rogue-like classes in games, often not rogue-like, but rogue-like classes in games have some kind of teleporter movement ability as well. You can imagine how this would be good on a spellcaster if the spellcaster is relatively squishy. Additionally, having ways to kind of stall for time can be good with damage over time damage. Cool. So obviously just picking those things, like there would be some unique strengths in context for combining most classes already. But like in the Pokemon Infinite Fusion example, you can still imagine that there must be some duds, right? There must be some places where a player is excited by the weird possibility of combining a barbarian and an artificer. A previous D&D character I played, by the way, was very fun. Barbarians can't spellcast while raging, which is their like power-up combat form, but artificers have a lot of magic stuff that doesn't require you to actually cast spells, like enchanted equipment and stuff. Very cool. It was surprisingly good. Don't take too many levels in artificer. Don't be an armorer. So let's say we pick up barbarian, artificer. What has the least synergy with those two? Maybe like a paladin, let's say. That's one. Maybe cleric, something like that. Now that would in Arcage have its own name, And what they would do is, because the emergent synergy between a lot of those abilities isn't as high, the designers, who are insane if they went through every individual combination, my word, put in hard-coded sort of combo effects between rather specific abilities. I'll give you another example. Wizards, or whatever equivalent it was in Arcage, had this fireball combo. Fireball, fireball, bigger fireball. And you really threw them, you slung them out like that. The rogue-like class had a backflip. So to make some space from the enemy, you'd backflip away and get a little burst of speed or something. I don't remember exactly. There was a specific synergy between those two abilities where if you use the backflip and you are a wizard and you use the fireball spell during the backflip, you throw out the initial fireballs of the attack immediately, instantly. So you got a little smack of fire added to your backflip as long as you hit the button. And the idea was that increased the viability of those otherwise rather bizarre fit effects. Does that make sense? This, I thought, was a really interesting approach. It means that the developers are using a tool to make it so more of the options have some merit, even if they aren't as obviously good as some other options. And there are also multiple different types of complexity. There's things where the game literally says these two abilities are good together, and there are many other situations where those abilities are very good together, but that's just meant to be intuitive, or you just sort of discover that yourself. They don't do anything special together other than what they say they do. Those two effects are just advantageous when used together, something like that. I thought this was really good. So this might be something like in Pokemon. I don't play that much of any kind of Pokemon, but I can kind of imagine, because I have in my life. There might be some Pokemon who imagine an ability that does a lot of damage to the user. It's got a lot of recoil. That's a mechanic in Pokemon. But then the enemy takes a lot of damage. So the attack has higher power, but in exchange, you take some damage back. Using a Pokemon, fusing a Pokemon with that Pokemon that has that attack, that has a healing ability, which is very rare in Pokemon, there's not that many healing options, would be a little stronger. There's some emergent synergy there. You would have the option to heal back up, so even if you were doing well, that could be valuable. The heal is already pretty good. There's nothing about those abilities that really makes it so that's better. It's just in the context of having the one, it's good to have the other. But you could also imagine something like maybe a Pokemon that has a Dream Eater is an ability that always fascinated me in Pokemon. This is an ability that lets you drain a bit of health and do damage to a sleeping Pokemon. Imagine if there was a Pokemon who had Dream Eater, which is really strong, but did not have an ability to put other Pokemon to sleep, and then another Pokemon which has otherwise good abilities and a sleep ability, but doesn't have Dream Eater. Those abilities do combo in a kind of hardwired way. You see what I mean? And that could be kind of interesting in and of itself. Now, in Pokemon specifically, that specific example, maybe isn't a thing. But I do still think that's an interesting direction to go in. Having it be that there's a mix of these kind of tightly built-in synergies and looser synergies. Like in Pokemon, because this isn't originally a mechanic in the original Pokemon games, I feel like you'd need to add a lot of design for that to be the case. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean it's not fun. As you said in your example about this game, there's the Elite Four quote about people winning with the Pokemon they love best. And then if the game adds difficulty options, then you can just have the player focus on making things powerful or viable to whatever extent they want, or the player can decide it's more fun to play this way, but then just make it so the game is at a difficulty level where that is viable, and then go from there. I'm simply arguing that in my platonic ideal build game, and I'm saying this so that people will maybe object and say, oh no, that doesn't matter, or that's bad in this way, or something. But right now, me thinking about it, I feel like the perfect version would be that the player doesn't need to think, I don't care about anything. My preferences have the import. And so I'm deciding that this is just a more fun way to play. I'm not going to get pushed around by the game, and therefore I'm okay with setting the difficulty settings my way. I think a lot of people still use difficulty settings when they're available in a game and don't mind and everything. But I do think that things being so wildly different in viability does push the player around a lot. In other words, I think that players would express themselves even more if things were relatively balanced. I think there's a threshold past which most people won't worry about the balance that much, but below that threshold, people care enough about something being like good enough, whatever their threshold for that is, that they will stop being interested in some of their preferences and pursue that instead. Is that bad? No, I guess not. But I would argue that it's very easy to get people to pursue something that's good. If you want to make a game that it's about getting something good, that's really easy to do. It's much harder to make a game that makes people pursue their preferences. And I think part of the way to do it, it comes down to balance. There being unique options available is of course important. There has to be a lot of stuff to choose from, and having a lot of those be, powerful in their own way, that's one thing. But I also think enough of the options have to be actually good approaches for like a requisite high, not necessarily really difficult, but like moderate difficulty, for the player to not just decide that it's more important to prioritize the game than themselves. However, more than 176,400 Pokemon, I mean, that's enough that what I'm saying might be a problem for the game. Maybe a lot of the options really aren't that viable, but there might be so many numerical viable options that it just doesn't matter at some point. This may be a weirdly good solution to the problem, where, here's another example. In Arknights, the game does this cool thing where there's a lot of different rarities for characters that you can roll for, and the Arknights has a lot of ways you can acquire characters. It does have that gacha system, but it has many other ways you can get them. And it has a lot of different rarities. The different rarities are vaguely correlated with power level. They are good at different things. You might have a 3 or 4 star character that does just do something unique, and so they are just kind of better or useful, even when you have 6-star characters, the highest rarity, simply because they do something that is different. They're not more powerful overall, but that's just irrelevant sometimes. When you need this thing, they do it. Sure, that's cool. And the game does a good job of that, but that's kind of at the entry level of this discussion. And yeah, the game does the thing where maybe synergy between two, lower rarity things would be really good. And there are even some hard-coded synergies, like there's a character that comes to mind who has a passive that literally just says 3-star or lower characters get like a buff, or are stronger, or, units that cost less to deploy, not always lower rarity, but a lot of lower rarity units are cheaper to deploy. They, get more healing, or it's easier to keep them alive. Now, are these buffs huge? They're not, but my point is, yeah, it uses all those design tools. But something that's bothered me for a while is that because there are not so many options, you do get to the point where for a given role, it's a little difficult to argue that a very versatile, high rarity character doesn't kind of eat the lunch of a lot of the rest of the game. But imagine if there were way more characters, like many, many dozens of times more characters, and they had way less things they were individually good at, and general purpose strengths were things that you could just engineer into your Arknights operator. But we're going back to Pokemon. In Arknights, I've got this guy who can make landmines and does extra damage against tankier boss enemies, and can turn his attacks into a single long-range rapid-fire machine gun for a sec, and can do splash damage or more damage to those tankier enemies. And this operator can more or less replace, like, all of the caster archetypes if you wanted to. There's also another operator that comes to mind, and she can turn into a volcano and fire AoE all over the map, or like get a little bonus on her attacks that will remove enemy resistance to her arts damage and do a little AoE. And this operator too can replace like more or less all of the caster archetypes. So it's not like no one else has any other benefits, but these characters have enough specific merits and only apply something that's generally useful in in the most general way, it is true that just having arts damage is valuable, but that's so easy to get. There are so many units that check that box, that it ultimately boils down to these just having more options. But imagine in Pokemon, imagine if you modified Pokemon, the game, not the, well, you were going to modify the Pokemon too, so that like having attacks that do good damage, there are lots of attacks that do good damage, is just commonplace. Everybody has that. Everyone can do that. Just like in Arknights, it's very easy to just get arts damage or block 3 enemies. Like everybody does that. It's fine. But then the specific Pokemon nearly always only have like a very unique strength, like a very, very specific thing. It's not usually something broad. And there are just an absolutely preposterous number of these, and they are somehow kind of balanced. There aren't some that are just way, way stronger than others, which there would be, but we're getting to that. I think that that model maybe hits the sweet spot where you're encouraging players to experiment a lot, and there are so many good options that even though there are a lot of bad options, the player can probably choose something with the Pokemon in this case that they like that is pretty good, that is in that, high enough percentile that it feels, good enough or whatever that they'll embrace their own preferences without you balancing too rigorously. The key thing here is that you don't have to balance too rigorously for a new reason. You can keep the difficulty kind of loose. That helps prevent things that are way stronger, significantly stronger anyway, from feeling too oppressive. Like you need to pick this option, you feel, because it's just so much more effective. It feels like a waste of time to pick something else. Some people don't get bothered by that, but lots of people do, so it needs to be addressed if you're going to make a really good game like this, I think. But if there are so many options that the player just doesn't know all of the different options that are really powerful, that feels like it might be meaningful. What challenges a lot of these games is the perception from the internet that people can always look up a powerful combination if they want, and so there is no hiding some overpowered thing in the game. But I wonder if there are enough things that are really strong and they're easy enough to find, actually, maybe the player won't get really fixated on one. Like in my Arknights example I gave you, there are a lot of units in Arknights, but there are few enough for certain archetypes that it isn't that difficult to go find the 1 or 2 options that kind of just eat the lunch of everything else if you focus on it that way. There are indeed, really are uses for different characters that don't do that. But not as many as there could be, is my point. Because there aren't that many options that are really, really strong. It's easy to get a short list of like, counting on one hand a number of overpowered options or whatever. That makes it feel easy to reduce the game to just those characters, I think. And another thing, again, is that they're strong in ways that are too general. They're good in ways that they either have too many niches and or the niches are too broad. And so you end up in a situation where, yeah, again, you can kind of reduce the game to just those options. But if everything is super specific and there's a ludicrous number of options, maybe there's something there. And then at that point, maybe, finally, you can just force the player to make some decisions and they won't be so hung up on, well, how good are these decisions? There will be enough good decisions that the player can live in their own meta where they've decided on the things that are important to them and they can have fun that way without feeling like they're doing something wrong or there's something way better they could be doing. Even though there will always be something better they could be doing. But there are so many of those things, maybe, that could kind of solve it for some people. It sounds cool. But just by the way, like I know you said at the top of this parlay, I'm not sure how much of this is a discussable topic and how much is just a vague recommendation. Densoro, lots of parlay are that way. It's very self-aware of you to say, that I'm kind of just recommending this game to you. But tons of parlay are like this. This parlay is more of a discussion topic than some other parlay I can think of. Not that that's bad or good either way. It doesn't matter, but just for what it's worth, I actually thought this was an excellent discussion topic. But yeah, it does sound really cool. I've seen quite a few games that do this riff The riff is Pokemon, but you can combine them together. The basic thing you do is you combine them together. Another similar game, which I also haven't played, but which was recommended to me, is called Cassette Beasts. Cassette Beasts, not Cassette Beats. Cassette Beasts, which is the same concept, but it isn't Pokemon. Um, yeah, it does sound really cool. In theory, I think there's a lot of boxes being checked here, and I hope I was able to draw some distinction between different types of combining things together, like multi-classing slash kit bashing, without defining those two things. Because to be honest, after this entire parlay, I'm not convinced there is a useful distinction between those two things. But there, you kind of did draw one out, which I can agree is definitely a distinction. I'm just, words sometimes do a unique thing for people's brains, and so I get, maybe they just don't work for me. But maybe you can think of multiclassing as a way of simply having both options, whereas kit bashing is having bits and pieces of each to some extent. There's more of an opportunity cost, maybe. So Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition multiclassing would be kit bashing, if you draw that distinction. Gundam Breaker builds sound like they would be kit bashing under that description. Whereas Pokemon Infinite Fusion, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance sound like they would be what in this example I'm referring to as multiclassing. Warframe helmet system would be kit bashing under my distinction between the two. Again, whether you like those terms or not, I think it makes no never mind. Just to say, I do think there is a significant difference there. Do you pick the same total number of pieces and they can be from one or multiple sources, or do you pick two entire sets of pieces, but you can maybe still only use the same number of pieces at once? Just to draw the distinction one more time, even though in Pokemon Infinite Fusion you combine Pokemon and they can maybe get all the moves from both Pokemon, let's just imagine. I don't know if that's how it works. You can still only use one move per turn. Same thing with a game like D&D, even in a version of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition where you simply get all of the abilities from two classes, you can still perhaps only use one action worth of abilities on your turn. And so that doesn't necessarily differentiate it from multi-classing in D&D 5th edition, which I'm calling kit bashing. That's getting confusing, where you pick the same 20 levels of stuff, but it can be from one or multiple sources. You don't get more things, but you do get to pick from more sources. Whereas in these other options, you literally get more options. Yeah, I don't know. You're kind of selling it to me. I started this parlay thinking, as I told you, that I like the sort of kit bashing approach where you really limit the amount of stuff the player is getting and add that extra layer of opportunity cost. But maybe there is something kind of good about this version. I will say briefly that all things being equal, it may still have some benefits in that it expands the design space. You could think of that 176,400 Pokemon count and then say, well, but if you only get the same 8 abilities that your Pokemon learns, but they can be from, your Zubat or your Execute that were combined together, your Rattata or your Charmander that are the base ingredients. You can only learn 8 total abilities, but they can be from either, versus a version where you learn all of both Pokemon's abilities. The version where you only learn 8 total abilities, it's almost like there are more Pokemon possible, more combination Pokemon possible. Because there can be a Rattata Charmander fusion that knows these 8 abilities and also these 8 abilities. Another way to put it is that in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, when you multiclass Warlock and Fighter, well, because you don't get all of both, we need more information to know what this character is like. Are they mostly a fighter that has a splash of Warlock, the other way around, or maybe a surprisingly even combination of the two? And of course, there's other stuff like which subclasses, but you get what I mean. How much of each did they take and what things? Whereas in these other systems where you just combine everything together, one, not necessarily drawback, but a trade-off is that once you have combined a Zubat and an Execute. If you get everything from both, that is what that combination is, period. There is in some way kind of less authorship there. There's a lower floor. You must combine two Pokemon in my example, but there's also a lower ceiling. Once you've combined two Pokemon, that's what it is. Like there is no or less choice after that, versus a version where you don't have to combine two Pokemon, but if you do, you need to pick and choose. There's a higher ceiling. Making the decision requires literally just more decisions, but there's also a higher floor. I meant to say floor before, you get the point. There are more possible ways to combine those two things that would be fun and or good. That seems meaningful. That seems good. In practice, sometimes the drawback here is that it lowers the number of options. Like, occasionally it can be interesting to have a system where you get everything, and a lot of it isn't initially that relevant, but it does give the thing slightly broader utility. Let me give you an example. So let's imagine the strongest overall rated by the community Pokemon combo of all of them, which we could never know, and that's not objectifiable anyway, but let's just imagine. And it's a Lugia Ho-Oh. I don't know. Again, I don't play Pokemon that much, so we're imagining some Unga Bunga Pokemon, okay? Well, this Pokemon has many strong abilities. And so if you take a weaker Pokemon, they have apparently weaker abilities for any individual decision the Pokemon can make. However, because their abilities aren't as strong, the opportunity cost of using a different ability is much lower for our weaker Pokemon than for our stronger Pokemon. To put it a different way, because our Lugia Ho-Oh can spam Solar Beam without charging it up, doing anything else is a lot worse because there's an opportunity cost. We have to not fire a Solar Beam without charging it up. Whereas my Zubat Execute thing, well, it can't do that. So if you use like Giga Drain instead, that's not as good, but it's also not as bad because we weren't losing out on some super strong attack. From the perspective of players, this often makes it feel like things that are weaker are relatively less weak. Like, making a decision on what ability to use is a little bit better. Even though technically it doesn't really affect like the output or power of each option, I do think that this has a big impact on players, to the extent that sometimes I've even seen people kind of arguing themselves in a circle and becoming confused to the point that they've made it sound like it really does make the weaker thing actually stronger, which of course it doesn't. Their abilities aren't literally better just because they don't have other good abilities, necessarily. They could be in context, but what I mean is the Giga Drain doesn't do more damage because it doesn't have Solar Beam, of course. You might be able to use like a jankier move because the Pokemon is so strong, or in whatever example. I'm just pointing out that from the player's perspective, I've noticed many a time that people have a positive experience when a Pokemon doesn't have an overbearingly powerful thing to do, but does have a lot of options. So perhaps allowing all of the abilities actually favors weaker options a little bit. Stronger options, by virtue of being stronger, will have more monopolizing options available, and thus it doesn't benefit them as much from the player's perspective if they're given every possible option. Does that make sense? It will begin to feel to the player like weaker combinations actually have more options for what to do because there isn't as obvious of a strong option. But maybe this just gets back to my point about the player not feeling like they can assert their own preference because of a thing seeming strong. And that isn't actually something that people would feel if we got rid of that, I would argue, negative feeling. I don't know. That would be what I would continue with if were we to continue talking about this. But for now, thank you for asking. I thought this was a lot of fun. I really just went on it for a while, so I hope that was okay. But I got very excited when I read this and just wanted to talk about it. So I hope that was all right. Thanks very much for the parlay. If you want to get your own, you can check out how to do that in the description. Densoro, thank you very much for yours.